Yes, friends, it is finally time for DEI to DIE. See what I did there? Hello, good people. It is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, getter of buckets, and yes, DEI is under attack. This is a good thing. Before we even talk about that, though, it's maybe good that we take a step back and remember that in the summer of 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States finally struck down race-based preferences in college admissions. Now, this kind of became the precursor for the downfall of DEI as we see basically company after company after company drop their DEI program. It's a huge waste of resources, and everyone, I think, knows intuitively that there's something wrong with it, even if you can't explain why. But that's what we're going to talk about today. Why is DEI such a waste of time and resources? Let's think about it this way. DEI almost always, despite what anyone tells you, ends up lowering the standards in order to meet their ideological commitments. And here's an example of Delano Squires explaining what happened in the college university system as an example.
Harvard has, the applicants ranked in deciles. So, first to 10th being the highest, number one being the lowest. A black student in the 4th decile has a higher chance of being admitted into Harvard than an Asian student in the 10th decile. Now, mind you, if you're in the 4th decile at Harvard, you're not some schlub. You'd probably be in the 8th decile at the University of Massachusetts. But that student is being given an artificial bump over a student who has a more competitive academic background because of this notion that this is going to, redress some of the issues that have gone on with race. Racial preferences are unsustainable because it's something that its proponents demand but will never claim. Because we'll say, we need racial preferences to keep the Ivy Leagues diverse. But then any particular black student who's there say, you only got in because of racial preferences. It's like, no, that's not true.
So you see that, and despite what the average, female minority talking head on TV tells you in a dishonest way, the only people who have to be twice as good just to get in the door are apparently those Asians who got turned away from those Ivy League schools. Now, the military is a kind of a less ambiguous case. We've seen obvious lowering of standards when it comes to females in combat roles and things of that nature. And they even promoting female leadership. This is why I seem to not be able to turn on my television and watch a movie without seeing some runway model who weighs 110 pounds being a leader of broad-shouldered men.
Lieutenant Commander, come in.
She's a powerful leader. Yes.
Yeah, that's like totally believable. The bottom line is that there's a very specific reason why DEI can't work. And that's because historically, competence and knowledge tends to be concentrated in very specific social circles. And that often means that ethnic groups or people from particular geographic locations will have a leg up on other people when it comes to specific competencies.
These are facts.
If you don't believe what I'm talking about, let's take a classic example. Germans, everyone knows, seems to make really good automobiles. They seem to have a kind of a leg up on automobile engineering excellence. I mean, just think about brands like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Audi, AMG, Porsche. These are all German brands. But why do they seem to excel when it comes to making cars? Well, that's because this guy named Carl Benz, maybe that name sounds familiar, he actually invented the automobile. So is it a shock that ever since this guy in his geographic location amongst his people actually invented the automobile, that people in Germany have tended to be just slightly ahead of the curve when it comes to automobile engineering and innovation? I would imagine that if you worked for Carl Benz or you were his son or you were his apprentice, that you would likely probably know more about automobile manufacturing and engineering than some, like, say, engineering student in another country. Why? Because you're working with the master. You're working with the guy who invented the concept. And I would imagine that small social circle, which tends to be German, and German are white people, I'm sad to say, they would tend to have just a built-in advantage when it comes to that institutional knowledge. Is anybody complaining, for example, that there aren't any high-level or well-reputed automobile manufacturers coming out of India? There are no high-level automobile engineering manufacturing groups coming out of Africa. And the question that I would have to ask to you is, why is that a problem? We have different competencies amongst different groups, and that's completely okay. As long as we are moving forward as a group, it is okay for people to have their specific areas of competence and expertise. Now, when we think about India, although they don't have any high-level engineering manufacturing groups coming out of India, what they tend to have is complete dominance in the tech field. Indian Asians make about 1% of the workforce, according to what I understand, but they're about 6% of the workforce in Silicon Valley. Now, just think about that. 6x representation relative to their population. And why is that? Because apparently in India, they have cultivated a kind of a culture of IT excellence. They pursue it. If your parents work in IT, then you work in IT, the chances are you got exposed to that stuff long before you ever went to college. And the same thing is true for any other thing. Contrary to popular belief, Black people excel in basketball not because we can run faster and jump higher. We're better at basketball is because culturally basketball is more important in the Black community. And once we see other cultures adopt that, then we see other cultures rise to excellence in basketball as well. If being great at basketball requires you to be able to run fast and jump high, then maybe someone should tell this guy or this guy. I mean, neither one of them can jump over a phone book, but they are at worst two of the best 5 players in the world. Now, interestingly enough, one of them hails from Serbia and the other from Slovenia. Slovenia and Serbia are in Eastern Europe, and they're just outside of what's in the middle of them, which is Croatia. Eastern Europe has long since been a hotbed of basketball excellence. I mean, just take Serbia, for example, where Nikola Jokic is from. There are 6 NBA players who come from Serbia. Well, Serbia is a relatively tiny country. It's 6.6 million people. And when you think about the fact that there are only 450 players in the NBA, the fact that such a tiny region of the world will produce 6 of those 450 best players in the world, how can 6.6 million people produce such high-level basketball excellence? The reason why is because in that culture and in those countries, basketball is culturally relevant. They play it from an early age. They understand it. And so Eastern Europe is a hotbed. Is there also any wonder why almost no basketball players come out of China or India?
Hey, it's Todd, the editor here. I was just thinking about this. Between India and China, there are like, 3 billion people? Just think about that. There's 3 billion people between India and China, somewhere thereabouts. And almost none of them are in the NBA. I just thought that was worth emphasizing.
Do you think that those people just are inherently inferior when it comes to basketball? It simply isn't true. Those cultures have different emphases and they have different cultural influences. And so that institutional knowledge and competence is concentrated in areas where we have that specialization and cultural influence. Now, let's circle back to India for a moment, because not only do we have overrepresentation of Indian Asians in the tech field, but they also rise to the top at an alarming rate. And no one seems to have a problem with this, and, nor should we. Just think about this. Google's CEO, or Alphabet, is Indian Asian. So is Microsoft's CEO. He's Indian Asian. So is the CEO of Vimeo. So is the CEO of IBM. So is the CEO of Adobe. Why are there so many Indian Asians rising to the top of these tech giants? It's simple, because the cultural influence is social, and social tends to be ethnic. And when you have ethnic groups who have a certain cultural influence, you will have a certain level of competence that is heightened coming out of those groups. This shouldn't be something that we try to tear down, but something that we should celebrate. I grew up in the Black church, and I'm going to tell you that some of the best musicians in the world come out of the Black church. You can look on any concert stage, on any concert, and you'll likely, unless it's country music probably, and you'll likely find some musician on the keys or on the drums or playing the bass who came out of the Black church. you will find an overrepresentation of that kind of musicianship. And why is that? It's because culturally, musicianship is a big deal in Black church. You should see, if you ever go to some of these Black church conferences and these meetings that they have, there'll be somebody on the drums and there'll be 6 or 7 kids who want to play the drums standing there watching him. And every time he does a lick or a fill, they're like, ooh, ah, they're like just taking it in. It's a different type of thing. And whenever you have that sort of culture, it is impossible to produce those effects without producing the culture. Now, believe it or not, there is a biblical explanation for this. If we go to Genesis chapter 4, we find a very strange little passage of scripture in verses 20 through around 22. Now, these 2 brothers, one's name is Jabal and the other is Jubal. And Jabal, it says, is the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock. But Jubal was the father of those who made and played string instruments and pipes. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. Why would it say that they are the father of them who do those things? Apparently, Jabal, for example, produced people who were very skilled and competent at farming and raising livestock. Now, anyone knows that you can't just pop out of bed and go raise a herd of goats or sheep or cows. That requires very specific institutional knowledge and competency. And apparently, Jabal figured that out and he passed that along to his children. And so that became kind of a cultural standard within their family group, that this is what we do. We're the tent people and we're the livestock people. The same thing is true when it came to Jubal. He apparently was a musician and he passed that musicianship and that knowledge on to his children, and they learned how to make and play instruments. Why is this a shock to anyone? You know, we actually have people whose last names are Shoemaker and Baker. And do you know why those surnames became prominent? It's because there were people who actually used to bake bread and they just became known as baker. Or people who made shoes and they became known as shoemaker. Their literal last name became synonymous with their existence and what they did for a living and what they were competent at. This is why DEI cannot survive, because it tends to tear at the very foundation of this principle of competency being developed socially and within specific groups. The presupposition of DEI is that we should have the same amount of competency in every area and in every strata of society, no matter the cultural influence. And this is just a lie. There's no reason to believe that it's true. The great Tom Sowell actually talks about this in his book, Discrimination and Disparities. He talks about how there are certain areas of the world, for example, 90-something% of the lightning strikes happen in Africa. Almost all the tornadoes in the world happen in Tornado Alley in the United States. Why would such vast expanses of land all over the world would all the tornadoes take place in a very concentrated area? He explains there are more diversity of life in one pond in the Amazon rainforest than it tends to be in all of the Great Lakes. Why would that be the case? It's because in those areas, there are very specific conditions that produce very specific effects. And the idea of homogeneity and randomness across all groups in every area is a completely new idea. And it is one that is invented by the left in order to socially engineer their political agenda. Don't make any mistake about it. These people don't really care about diversity. What they care is about imposing their political ideas on people under the guise of diversity, under the guise of group preferences and supposed fairness. Really, what we should be saying is, what does each group bring to the table? What is their competencies? How do we duplicate that? How do we capitalize on those social circles that produce in these higher levels of institutional knowledge and preserves it and passes it along efficiently? Once we get to that and we stop this simple-minded head counting of different colors and different ethnicities and different genders in every strata of society, then we'll move on and actually have success and make America great again, not only now, but in the future. But I'm curious to know your thoughts. Do we think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a scam, or is there something to it? Let me know. I appreciate your time, my friends. And until next time, God bless you.